You are in China. The night air is warm and still, heavy with the smell of oil lamps and old wood. Imagine narrow streets breathing softly, shutters half closed, footsteps muted by centuries of dust. Imogine smoke curling not in panic but in patience, thin, sweet, almost polite, like it knows it will be welcomed if it just waits long enough. Before we drift any deeper, if this slow, quiet way of telling history feels good to you, take a gentle second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, leave a small comment telling me where you're listening from and what your local time is right now. I like imagining these stories traveling across different nights. Now you let yourself walk forward. You are in China, but not the postcard version. Not dragons and fireworks. This is the everyday China of the late Qing era alleys, where time feels layered, where routines repeat so reliably that no one notices when something new slips in. The first time you encounter opium, it doesn't announce itself as danger. It doesn't crash through the door. It sits, it waits, it pretends to belong. At first, it wears the face of medicine. A resin scraped from poppy pods, praised for easing pain, calming coughs, settling stomachs, nothing dramatic. Just another remedy in a long tradition of remedies. You hear it spoken about the way people talk about strong tea or wine, useful in moderation, indulgent if you can afford it, nothing to fear if you're sensible. And everyone, of course, believes they are sensible. Here's a simple historical fact that often gets skipped because it ruins the neat villain story. Opium was already known in China long before foreigners flooded the market. What changed wasn't its existence, it was its scale, its purity, and the speed at which it moved. Those differences matter. They turn a habit into a system. You notice how the rooms are arranged. Low couches, lamps dimmed deliberately, pipes cleaned with care. This is not chaos. It's ritual. And ritual has a way of disarming suspicion. When something has rules, when it has etiquette, it feels controlled, even if it isn't. A quirky detail historians like to whisper about late at night. Some users believed the first dream after smoking opium was the most honest one, a kind of private truth your waking mind was too polite to admit. Whether that's true doesn't matter. What matters is that people believed it. And belief, as you'll see, is one of the most powerful substances in this entire story. You move through a city where silver coins clink softly in sleeves, where merchants calculate not just profit but balance. For generations, China exported tea, silk, porcelain objects the rest of the world craved. Silver flowed in. Then, slowly, subtly, it began to flow out. History rarely chooses just one sin. You feel the change before you can name it. Pipes appear more often. Sessions last longer. The polite after-dinner indulgence stretches into the afternoon, then into the morning. Addiction doesn't arrive with a drum roll. It rearranges your schedule and waits for you to notice. Families adapt. At first, they sell small things, a decorative bowl, extra clothing, labor shifts, time stretches, productivity thins. Another historical fact slides in quietly here. By the early 19th century, millions in China were habitual users, not caricatures, farmers, clerks, soldiers, the backbone of daily life. You start hearing moral arguments, but they're oddly distant. Officials issue edicts that read well on paper and evaporate in practice. Enforcement requires energy, and energy is expensive when the system itself is tired. Corruption doesn't need villains, it needs low salaries, and high temptations. Remember this feeling because it will come back later. The sense that everyone sees the problem, but no one wants to be the first to admit how deep it goes. There's a strange calm before outrage. Foreign merchants reassure themselves with tidy logic. If we didn't sell it, someone else would. Demand exists. Markets respond. Responsibility dissolves into abstraction. Meanwhile, Chinese scholars argue among themselves. Some insist moral decay is the cause of weakness. Others whisper that weakness invites decay. Circular debates are very good at passing time. Opium reshapes evenings first, then mornings, then expectations. You notice how people measure the day differently now, not by work completed, but by relief achieved. Pain avoidance becomes a lifestyle, and once a society starts organizing around numbness, it becomes easier to manage and easier to exploit. Another fringe tidbit, the kind that makes historians smile sadly. Some Qing officials experimented with controlled opium use themselves, believing personal moderation would give them moral authority to regulate others. It didn't. It just blurred their urgency. By the time alarms start ringing loudly, the sound feels rude, disruptive, almost impolite. The substance has already woven itself into trade routes, tax expectations, social routines. Removing it now would mean admitting the system was wrong, not just exploited. And that's the real sedative effect of opium here, not the smoke. The delay, the way it teaches a civilization to wait instead of act. You stand at the edge of this realization as the night deepens. Lamps flicker, pipes cool. Somewhere far away, ships are already moving, holds heavy with cargo that will change everything. No one calls this destruction yet. It doesn't feel violent. It feels manageable, temporary, rational. That's how it always starts. The next thing you notice is how ordinary it all feels. That's the part that should worry you most, but it doesn't because nothing dangerous ever announces itself as extraordinary in the beginning. Opium doesn't storm into your life wearing the costume of ruin. It shows up wrapped in familiarity, tucked neatly into routines that already exist. You don't feel like you're changing. You feel like you're continuing. You're told gently that this is still medicine, that it soothes digestion, steadies nerves, sharpens thought when used correctly. And the word correctly does a lot of work here. It creates a loophole big enough to swallow entire afternoons. Everyone knows someone who uses it only when necessary. Everyone believes they are not that person. The shift happens quietly. The remedy becomes a reward. You finish a long day, your muscles ache, your patience is thin, and there it is waiting, predictable, reliable. Pain disappears first, then worry. Then the edges of thought soften, like corners being sanded down. The mind doesn't race anymore. It floats, and floating feels like control, especially in a world where so much is already decided for you. Here's a historical fact that often gets misunderstood. For a long time, opium smoking in China was less stigmatized than alcohol abuse. Drunkenness caused noise, disorder, embarrassment. Opium caused silence, calm, stillness. A society that values harmony finds that distinction persuasive. You watch how spaces change. Smoking rooms aren't chaotic dens, they're curated environments. Cushions arranged carefully. Lamps lowered just enough. Pipes treated almost like instruments. There's etiquette now. How to prepare, how to inhale, how to rest afterward. Rules turn indulgence into culture, and culture is sticky. A quirky tidbit slips in through the cracks. Some users believe different pipe materials influence the quality of dreams: bamboo for clarity, jade for calm, metal for intensity. There's no science behind it, but that's the point. When a habit starts generating folklore, it has already moved beyond function. You start to hear language shift too. People don't say they need opium, they say it helps, it balances, it supports. Words that sound cooperative rather than dependent. Even concern arrives wrapped in politeness. Family members suggest moderation, not abstinence. Reduce frequency, shorten sessions. Never stop. Outright stopping implies danger, and no one wants to admit that yet. This is where normalization does its most delicate work. It reframes excess as personal failure rather than systemic design. If someone slips too far, it's because they lacked discipline, not because the substance was engineered to invite repetition. The system stays innocent. The individual absorbs the blame. There's a scholarly debate that hums quietly beneath all this. Did widespread addiction cause China's decline? Or did a declining system make addiction more likely? You can feel how both answers try to be true at the same time. Weak institutions struggle to regulate. Widespread dependency further weakens institutions. The loop closes gently, without drama. You notice it in labor first. Work still happens, but slower. Tasks stretch. Precision dulls. A farmer misses a planting window. A clerk miscounts. A soldier reacts a fraction too late. Nothing collapses immediately. That's the trick. Damage accumulates the way dust does, thin layers settling everywhere until breathing feels different. Families begin compensating. Someone works longer hours. Someone else sells a small asset. The economy adjusts around the habit instead of challenging it. This adaptability looks like resilience, but its actions, warnings, feels hostile, even cruel. This is the most dangerous moment, and almost no one recognizes it as such. Because now, opium isn't an intruder, it's a collaborator. You hear officials speak of gradual solutions, phase-outs, licenses, taxes. Each proposal assumes time is abundant. Each one assumes the system can absorb delay. But dependency doesn't wait politely for policy. It adapts faster than paperwork ever will. There's another fringe detail historians argue about late into the night. Some doctors of the era claimed opium enhanced focus when used sparingly, citing scholars who wrote for hours after smoking. Were they wrong? Or were they observing a short-term cognitive effect that masked long-term decline? The evidence is mixed, which makes the claim tempting and dangerous. Ambiguity is fertile ground for inaction. You feel the atmosphere thicken, not with fear yet, just with familiarity. When something becomes part of the background, it stops being questioned. Pipes sit beside teacups. Smoke drifts like incense. Silence becomes comfort instead of warning. And somewhere beyond the horizon, merchants are counting shipments, governments are counting silver, and the system is counting on this normalization to hold. You don't see collapse yet. You see comfort. And comfort, when it arrives early, has a way of stealing urgency from the future. You move through another night. Lamps dim. The city exhales. And without realizing it, you've crossed a line. Not into chaos, but into acceptance. The kind that doesn't feel like surrender until much later, when looking back finally hurts. You start to notice the sound of silver before you notice its absence. Coins sliding across wood, the soft, satisfied clink at the end of a transaction. For centuries, that sound meant stability. It meant China's place in the world made sense. Tea went out, silk went out, porcelain went out, silver came in. Simple, elegant, predictable. But predictability has a weakness. It assumes tomorrow will behave like yesterday. At first, the change is so subtle you'd miss it if you weren't paying attention. Merchants linger longer before agreeing on prices. Tax collectors return with numbers that don't quite add up. Someone mentions that silver feels tight this year. Not scarce, just cautious. The word passes through conversations and disappears again. Here's the historical fact that turns unease into alarm, though few recognize it in time. China's economy ran on silver, not paper promises. When silver flowed out faster than it flowed in, everything from wages to taxes began to strain at once. This wasn't inflation or recession as modern terms would describe. It was a system quietly losing its bloodstream, and opium is at the center of it. Foreign merchants, especially those tied to British trade networks through India, don't need silver from China if they can get it elsewhere. Opium flips the equation. Chinese buyers pay in silver. The metal reverses direction. Outbound. Ship after ship. The math is clean. The consequences are not. You can almost feel the arithmetic settling in. For every pipe lit, a fraction of a coin leaves the system. For every crate unloaded, another imbalance deepens. No single transaction looks catastrophic. Together, they begin to reshape the ground beneath your feet. There's a strange irony here. One scholars still debate with careful phrasing. The opium trade didn't just exploit China's weakness, it exploited its strength. A massive population, a deep internal market, a long tradition of commercial discipline. The very things that made China stable made it lucrative to drain. You walk through markets where prices wobble without explanation. A sack of rice costs more this month, though harvests were fine. Rent creeps upward, wages lag behind. People don't blame opium directly. They blame weather, officials, fate, anything closer and easier to name. A fringe tidbit floats through merchant gossip. Some traders privately referred to opium as black tea, not as code to hide it, but because it flowed with the same reliability and profit margin. When a commodity earns a nickname that casual, it has already been normalized into the logic of trade. You see officials trying to respond with familiar tools, adjust tax rates, delay collections, encourage local silver circulation. Each move treats symptoms, not cause, and the cause is uncomfortable to confront because it connects domestic decay with foreign leverage. This is where denial becomes policy. Another scholarly argument hums beneath the surface. Was the Qing court fully aware of the scale of the silver drain early on, or did bureaucratic distance blur the numbers until correction became impossible? Records suggest both awareness and paralysis, a lethal combination. Knowing without acting is often worse than ignorance. You watch the countryside feel the strain first. Farmers pay taxes in silver but earn in grain. When silver tightens, the conversion hurts. Debts stretch. Land changes hands quietly, not through conquest but through paperwork. Loss without drama. And in the cities, merchants adapt. They always do. Credit networks expand. Informal lending grows. Opium itself becomes collateral in some circles, a substance backing financial trust. When addiction becomes a unit of exchange, you know the system has crossed into strange territory. The emotional tone shifts now, still not panic, more like irritation, a sense that things are harder than they should be. People work more for the same return. The day feels longer, relief feels shorter. You notice something else, too. Foreign merchants aren't nervous. They're confident. Their ledgers balance beautifully. Their ships keep moving. When pressure appears on one port, they reroute to another. Flexibility is power, and power rarely feels rushed. This asymmetry matters because while China absorbs the social cost of addiction and the economic cost of silver loss, the profit travels outward, reinforcing distant economies that never see the smoke or the silence. Distance becomes insulation, moral distance even more so. You overhear an official mutter that trade has become unbalanced in spirit, not just numbers. It's an oddly poetic phrase, and it doesn't make it into any decree, but it lingers. Because spirit is what's being traded away here. Confidence, momentum, belief that the system still protects those inside it. The quiet realization settles in. This isn't just about a drug. It's about leverage, about who controls the terms of exchange, about how easily a civilization can be nudged off balance without a single battle being fought. Yet, you stand in a market. As evening approaches, silver changes hands one more time. A pipe is lit somewhere nearby. Two transactions, completely unrelated except they're not. They're part of the same invisible equation, one that keeps adding up even when no one wants to look at the total, and the sum, slowly, relentlessly, is moving against you. Now the story sharpens its teeth, because somewhere far from these quiet rooms and silver short markets, men in clean coats are solving a problem, and they are very proud of the solution. You don't hear their voices yet, but you feel their decisions like pressure changes before a storm. Britain has an issue that keeps returning no matter how many reports are filed. China doesn't need British goods. Not really. Cotton sits unwanted. Manufactured items feel inferior to local craftsmanship. But British society is already addicted to Chinese tea, silk, porcelain. Addiction on one side, indifference on the other. Empires hate imbalance unless they control it. So they do what empires always do. They reframe the problem. Opium isn't described as a poison in these discussions. It's described as a commodity, a trade good, a balancing agent. Grown in British-controlled India, processed efficiently, transported reliably. The numbers are elegant, costs low, demand elastic, risk externalized. Here's the historical fact that snaps the moral tension into focus. The British government officially banned opium at home while aggressively expanding its export abroad. Two moral systems, one border. Inside the empire, addiction is vice. Outside, it's revenue. You feel the chill of that logic, even if you don't know its language. Ships leave Indian ports heavy with cargo, their routes optimized like veins. Insurance policies written, profits anticipated before sales even catch wind. No one on board sees themselves as a villain. They see themselves as participants in trade. And trade, after all, is neutral, right? A quirky, unsettling tidbit surfaces here. Some merchants referred to opium shipments as self-moving cargo. Because demand was so reliable, it felt like the product was pulling itself into ports. When supply feels inevitable, responsibility feels optional. You return to China's coast, where this inevitability begins to press harder. Canton's old system, tight controls, limited foreign contact starts to creak. Smuggling networks thrive precisely because regulation exists. Every restriction creates a workaround. Every workaround creates profit. The black market doesn't feel criminal, it feels entrepreneurial. Officials know, of course they know, but knowing isn't the same as stopping. Enforcement costs money, corruption pays immediately, and the moral argument sounds thin when silver shortages are already squeezing budgets. Here's where the story becomes painfully human. An official accepts a bribe not because he's evil, but because his salary no longer covers his household. A merchant looks away because refusing would mean losing his competitor's advantage. A local enforcer delays action because unrest would look worse than quiet decay. Systemic failure doesn't arrive with banners. It arrives through reasonable compromises made repeatedly. There's a scholarly debate historians still circle carefully. Did British policymakers anticipate the scale of social damage opium would cause in China, or did they genuinely believe Chinese society would self-regulate as European societies claim to? The documents suggest a mix of arrogance and willful blindness, a dangerous pairing. You feel tension now, not just comfort fading. The atmosphere thickens, rumors circulate, more pipes, stronger blends, younger users. The timeline accelerates. What once took years now takes months. And still no war, no explosions, just contracts, cargo habits. The brilliance of this strategy, if you can stomach calling it that, is its invisibility. Guns draw resistance. Addiction draws accommodation. By the time outrage forms, dependency has already rearranged incentives. Fighting back means breaking too many systems at once. You hear whispers of outrage finally rising in the capital. Memorials written, warnings issued. Words like moral rot and foreign exploitation appear in official language for the first time. But words alone move slowly. Ships do not. Another strange detail from the margins of history. Some British officials privately worried that flooding China with opium might eventually destabilize the region, and then dismissed the concern because instability didn't threaten British soil. Distance dulls foresight. You feel the asymmetry tighten like a knot. One side bleeds silver, health, momentum. The other gains leverage, confidence, reach. This is not accidental. It's engineered, quietly, patiently, and here's the moment you realize the tone has changed. Opium is no longer just tolerated, it's defended. Merchants argue that banning it would harm livelihoods. Officials warn of rebellion if supply stops suddenly. Even users insist prohibition would be cruel. The substance has acquired allies. That's when you know something irreversible has begun. You stand at the edge of the coast, watching another ship unload under cover of night. Crates disappear into warehouses. Ledgers balance somewhere far away. And inside the empire, the fix feels complete. The problem has been solved, just not for the people living with the consequences. This isn't collapse yet. This is the moment power quietly changes hands without a single flag being raised. The ports are where the lie finally starts to sweat. By day, everything looks disciplined. Flags hang politely. Paperwork moves from desk to desk. Interpreters smooth sharp edges with careful words. The Canton system still insists it controls the flow. Foreign traders confined, movement monitored, commerce neatly boxed into rules written generations ago. On paper, the empire is still steering. By night, the city exhales differently. Boats without flags slide across dark water. Lanterns blink once, twice signals older than any law. Crates move faster when no one is supposed to be watching. Opium doesn't ask permission anymore. It negotiates through habit, hunger, and profit. The port never truly sleeps, because sleep would require innocence. Here's a historical fact that sharpens the picture. Despite strict regulations, the majority of opium entering China did so illegally right under the nose of a system designed to prevent it. When law and reality diverge long enough, reality wins by default. You walk along the waterfront and feel the contradiction. Official trade houses stand rigid and ceremonial, while just beyond them, warehouses hum with unofficial efficiency. This is where the empire's confidence erodes not through invasion, but through redundancy. Rules that can be bypassed lose authority. Authority, once lost, is hard to recover. A quirky tidbit surfaces among dock workers. Some claim they could identify opium shipments by smell alone, even before opening crates, a faint sweetness cutting through tar and salt. Whether true or not, the idea matters. It suggests how familiar the substance had become. Recognition replaces suspicion. Merchants adapt faster than governments ever do. They form networks that stretch beyond any single port. If Canton tightens, traffic shifts to another harbor. If patrols increase, routes reroute. Flexibility becomes a weapon, and China's rigidity, once a strength, now becomes a vulnerability. You notice how money changes hands here. Not dramatically, casually. A favor owed, a delay granted, a blind eye rewarded. Corruption doesn't announce itself. It blends into the workflow. Soon, it's impossible to tell where enforcement ends and accommodation begins. This is where officials begin lying to themselves. They convince themselves the problem is localized, containable, that cracking down too hard would disrupt stability, that slow leakage is preferable to sudden rupture. These arguments sound reasonable, especially when spoken softly in committee rooms. But every compromise teaches smugglers exactly how much pressure the system can tolerate. There's a scholarly debate historians return to again and again. Was the Canton system doomed because it was too closed, or because it was closed too late? Either way, by the time it faced opium at scale, it was fighting a modern network with antique tools. You feel the human cost ripple outward. Dock workers start smoking between shifts. Guards accept payment not just in silver, but in the product itself. Addiction spreads sideways across roles, not just classes. The port becomes a classroom where dependence is taught informally, efficiently. Another unsettling detail. Some foreign traders never set foot inland, yet shape the fate of millions simply by adjusting supply at the coast. Power without proximity, influence without exposure. It's a pattern that will repeat in other centuries, under different names. At night, the water reflects lanterns like broken stars. You watch a shipment vanish into the city, its value already calculated, its consequences deferred. Somewhere, an official drafts another memo about moderation. Somewhere else, a family sells a tool to cover a debt. The port hums because it must. Stopping now would collapse too many quiet agreements. Everyone involved tells themselves they are managing the situation. No one admits they are being managed by it. And this is the moment the system tips, not loudly, not visibly, but decisively. Control has shifted from law to logistics, from policy to pipelines. The empire still stands, the gates are still guarded, but the flow is no longer obeying commands. It's obeying demand. You turn away from the water, knowing something irreversible has happened here. Not because the rules failed, but because everyone learned how to live without them. You can tell a system is in trouble when silence becomes policy. Not the calm, ceremonial silence of respect, but the practiced kind. The kind that settles in rooms where everyone understands the risk of speaking too clearly. Inside the Qing bureaucracy, this silence spreads faster than any decree. Reports soften their language. Numbers round themselves down. Problems arrive, described as manageable, long after they've stopped being so. You feel it in the way officials hold their cups now, tighter, longer, as if warmth might leak away if they loosen their grip. Corruption doesn't erupt here, it seeps. A local magistrate allows a shipment through because tomorrow's inspection will cost money he doesn't have. A customs officer accepts opium instead of silver because silver has become strangely hard to come by. A regional official delays forwarding complaints upward because too many complaints suggest failure, and failure travels downhill faster than praise ever does. Here's a historical fact that sounds almost unbelievable until you sit with it. Some officials responsible for enforcing anti-opium edicts were themselves dependent on the drug. Not in secret, not always in shame, sometimes openly enough that it became another unspoken compromise. Enforcement becomes theater when the enforcers are entangled in the same habits they're meant to stop. You watch the logic justify itself. If the problem is everywhere, no one is personally responsible. If everyone is compromised, then compromise becomes normal. This isn't moral collapse, it's administrative exhaustion. A quirky tidbit whispered in later memoirs. Certain officials believed opium made long bureaucratic sessions tolerable, dulling frustration without dulling thought. They were wrong, of course, but the belief mattered. It allowed them to think of their dependency as a tool rather than a weakness. And then there's fear. Fear of unrest, fear of foreign retaliation, fear of disrupting trade so badly that the fragile economy snaps outright. Each fear pulls in a different direction, and paralysis settles in the center. When choices all feel dangerous, doing nothing starts to look prudent. There's a scholarly debate that still lingers here. Was the Qing court indecisive because it lacked information, or because it had too much of it? Reports flooded and conflicting, delayed, filtered. Action requires clarity. Bureaucracy excels at producing fog. You notice how edicts change tone. Early ones sound moral, almost offended. Later ones sound technical. Reduce intake, register smokers, tax production. When morality fails to motivate compliance, governments often turn to accounting. But addiction doesn't respect spreadsheets. The public notices the hesitation. Respect erodes not through rebellion, but through imitation. If officials bend rules, why shouldn't everyone else? Law becomes suggestion. Suggestion becomes habit. Another quiet consequence emerges. Trust thins. Communities stop believing the state will protect them from harm. Families stop believing warnings carry weight. Once trust drains away, authority becomes expensive. You have to pay for every obedience. You stand in an office late at night, lamps burn low, paper stacks lean slightly, like they're tired. Somewhere, someone chooses not to write a report that would force a decision. Somewhere else, someone files one that says just enough to appear diligent without inviting scrutiny. The system is still functioning. That's the most dangerous part. It hasn't collapsed loudly enough to demand reform. It hasn't stabilized enough to relax. It exists in a gray, humming middle where damage accumulates quietly. And outside these offices, the pipes are still warm. Eventually, silence meets someone who can't tolerate it. You hear his name before you feel his presence spoken with a mix of relief and unease. The way people talk about a storm that might finally break the heat. Lin Zexu does not enter the story gently. He arrives carrying conviction, and conviction is disruptive in a system built on accommodation. He reads the softened reports and asks for the unsmoothed versions. He listens to the polite explanations and hears excuses instead. Where others weigh consequences, he weighs responsibility. And once he decides what must be done, the question of comfort quietly exits the room. Here's the historical fact that hardens the air. Lin Zexu was appointed with extraordinary authority to suppress the opium trade, precisely because ordinary authority had failed. This wasn't routine governance. It was an intervention. You feel the mood change in Canton almost immediately. Inspections become real. Warehouses get searched. Officials who once floated now find their feet touching ground again. Merchants sense it too, the way animals sense weather shifts before rain. Smiles tighten. Conversations shorten. Lin doesn't argue that opium is merely bad for the economy. He frames it as moral corrosion. He writes that allowing addiction is equivalent to slowly killing the people you are meant to protect. That language matters. It refuses neutrality. It makes an action look like participation. A quirky, almost cinematic detail survives in accounts from the time Lin reportedly forced foreign merchants to sign pledges swearing they would never again trade opium in China under penalty of death. Whether every signature was sincere is doubtful. What mattered was the message. This was no longer a debate. You watch the confiscations begin. Crates stacked, seals broken. The scale is shocking even to those who thought they understood the trade. This isn't a leak. It's a flood that had been politely ignored. There's a scholarly debate here that never quite settles. Was Lin Zexu naive about foreign reaction? Or was he knowingly forcing a confrontation because delay had become more dangerous than conflict? The answer depends on whether you believe moral clarity is compatible with geopolitical realism. Lin writes a letter to the British monarch, measured, reasoned, almost pleading. He asks a question so simple it feels radical. If opium is forbidden in Britain because it harms your people, why is it acceptable to sell it to mine? The letter may never have reached its intended reader, but the question still echoes. You feel the tension coil tight now. Foreign merchants protest. Diplomats bristle. The language of free trade collides with the language of sovereignty. Each side believes the other is violating a fundamental principle, and then the moment arrives that snaps restraint. Thousands of chests of opium are destroyed, emptied, dissolved, poured into the sea. The water turns dark, then cloudy, then clears again. It takes weeks. Guards stand watch. The message is unmistakable. This trade ends here. Another strange detail. Some observers noted the irony that the sea, once the route of smuggling, became the instrument of purification. Symbolism doesn't change outcomes, but it sharpens memory. You sense the shift instantly. What was tolerated has been condemned. What was managed has been attacked. For the first time, the system has chosen action over balance. And action has consequences. Foreign outrage builds fast, fueled by loss and principle in equal measure. This isn't just about destroyed cargo, it's about precedent. If China can destroy foreign property, what does that mean for power dynamics everywhere else? Lin stands firm. He believes moral right will shield the empire. He believes law, once enforced, will reassert itself. He underestimates something crucial, not foreign anger, but foreign confidence. As the last crate dissolves into the water, you feel a strange calm, a sense that something long delayed has finally happened. Relief flickers, but beneath it, pressure builds. Because history rarely forgives decisive moral action when it threatens profitable systems. And the sea, now quiet again, has already carried the news outward. The sea does not stay quiet for long. At first, the outrage arrives as words, letters, complaints, carefully phrased demands, wrapped in the language of injury, destroyed property, broken trust, unacceptable precedent. The tone is offended, not yet furious. This is how powerful systems test resistance, with paperwork before gunpowder. But beneath the words, something harder is forming. You feel it in the ports, where foreign ships linger longer than necessary, in the way merchants stop pretending this is a misunderstanding. The destruction of opium wasn't just a loss, it was an insult. And empires, like individuals, react badly to being embarrassed in public. Here's the historical fact that tips the balance. The value of the destroyed opium was enormous, representing years of profit and investment. Compensation is demanded. When it isn't offered, grievance hardens into justification. Once money is framed as a right, force begins to look reasonable. Lin Zexu is recalled, not because he was wrong, but because he was inconvenient. Moral clarity, it turns out, is difficult to defend once consequences become international. His removal feels like relief to some, betrayal to others. To foreign observers, it reads as weakness. A quirky detail survives in private correspondence. Some British officers reportedly saw the opium destruction as proof that China didn't understand modern trade, as if ethics themselves were outdated technology. That assumption will shape everything that follows. You notice preparations now, not openly announced, but unmistakable. Ships reposition, crews drill, cannons are cleaned. The machinery of conflict doesn't rush, it checks its angles. China, meanwhile, expects negotiation. History has taught it that barbarians complain, concessions are made, and stability returns. What it hasn't faced yet is an industrial power that believes trade is a moral right enforceable by steel. This is the miscalculation that matters. There's a scholarly debate that still simmers. Could war have been avoided if compensation had been paid? Or was conflict inevitable once opium became the hinge of imperial economics? Many argue the latter. When profit depends on addiction, reform becomes an existential threat. The first shots feel unreal when they come, not because they're quiet, but because they're distant. Cannon fire echoes over water, not streets. The violence begins offshore, where the rules of engagement feel abstract. Chinese defenses are brave, but outdated. Junks face steam-powered ships. Courage meets calculus. You sense shock spreading faster than fear. This isn't how conflicts are supposed to work. There are no long declarations, no careful escalations, just a demonstration, a message delivered in iron. Another unsettling detail. Some Chinese officials initially believed the explosions were ceremonial signals, not attacks. By the time understanding catches up, momentum has already shifted. The war that follows isn't long, but it is lopsided. Technology decides outcomes before strategy has time to matter. Forts fall, rivers open. The empire learns, too late, that moral authority does not translate into naval range. And yet, even now, there's disbelief. Surely this will stop. Surely reason will intervene. Surely trade will resume without further humiliation. You watch as negotiations restart, not as equals, but as damage control. Terms are discussed, ports named, indemnities calculated. The conversation is no longer about opium alone. It's about access, influence, control. The destruction of the drug was meant to cleanse the system. Instead, it exposed the system's vulnerability. As smoke drifts over the water, you realize the irony settling in. The attempt to end addiction has triggered a different kind of dependency on foreign power, foreign rules, foreign restraint. The sea carries more than cargo now. It carries a new order. You feel the difference immediately, not just in volume, but in certainty. This isn't warning fire anymore. This is demonstration. British ships don't maneuver like the vessels you know. They don't wait for wind. They don't hesitate near shore. They arrive with the confidence of machines that have already rehearsed the outcome. Here's the historical fact that makes resistance feel unreal. Britain's steam-powered gunboats could move independently of wind and tide, while most Chinese vessels still depended on nature's cooperation. Warfare has crossed a technological threshold, and China doesn't realize how far behind it stands until the gap is measured in explosions. Fortifications that once symbolized security crumble quickly. Cannons mounted with pride fire once, maybe twice, before being outranged. Defenders fight bravely, sometimes recklessly, but bravery cannot shorten distance or harden outdated metal. The lesson is brutal and immediate. Tradition does not stop momentum. A strange, almost tragic tidbit surfaces from eyewitness accounts. Some defenders believed the enemy ships were invulnerable, protected by some kind of foreign magic. When technology leaps far enough ahead, it stops looking like progress and starts looking like myth. You watch cities along rivers open like unlocked doors. Control of waterways becomes control of movement, trade, supply, morale. This is not conquest by occupation, it's conquest by access. The British don't need to rule China, they just need to reach wherever pressure is most effective. Shock ripples inward faster than troops ever could. Officials scramble to interpret reports that don't match expectation. Losses pile up with no satisfying explanation. This isn't how wars have been fought before. There are no decisive cavalry charges, no symbolic sieges, just steady, precise force applied where it hurts most. There's a scholarly debate here that cuts uncomfortably close to the bone. Was the Opium War truly about opium, or was it a violent lesson in modernization delivered under the cover of trade? Many argue opium was the trigger, but technology was the verdict. You feel morale buckle. Not collapse yet, but bend. Confidence in the empire's ability to defend itself thins. Rumors outpace orders. Soldiers fight, retreat, regroup, and fight again, but always one step behind an enemy that seems to choose when and where engagement happens. Another detail rarely emphasized. British commanders often avoided unnecessary casualties, not out of mercy, but efficiency. Overwhelming force, applied briefly, broke resistance faster than prolonged brutality. The result felt surgical and terrifying. Negotiations reopen under entirely different lighting now, not as discussions, but as calculations. How much damage can be avoided? How much humiliation is tolerable? The language shifts from principle to mitigation. You notice something subtle but devastating. Opium fades from the center of the conversation. The war that began over a drug becomes about ports, tariffs, movement. The original moral question, should this trade exist at all, slips quietly out the side door. And that's how power rewrites history in real time. By the time ceasefires are discussed, the outcome is no longer in doubt. What remains undecided is how much sovereignty will be shaved away in the process. The empire hasn't fallen, but it has been measured and found wanting. The war ends the way unequal fights usually do, not with clarity, but with paperwork. You're not standing in a ruined capital or a burning field. You're standing in rooms where pens move slowly across paper, where translators pause too long between sentences, where every word feels heavier than the last because it will outlive the people writing it. This is where loss becomes permanent. Here's the historical fact that quietly redraws the future. The Treaty of Nanjing forces China to open ports, pay indemnities, cede territory, and grant foreign traders unprecedented access, all without addressing the opium trade itself. The war that began over a drug ends without removing it. That omission is not accidental, it's strategic. You notice how the language works. Most favored nation, extraterritoriality, free trade. These phrases sound neutral, even fair, until you realize they apply unevenly. Foreign merchants operate under their own laws, judged by their own courts, protected by their own governments. Chinese authority stops at the edge of foreign privilege. Sovereignty doesn't vanish in a single moment. It thins. It becomes conditional, a quirky detail buried in the aftermath. The indemnity payments are so large that China must raise taxes internally, pushing more people toward poverty, ironically making opium relief even more tempting. Defeat feeds dependency. Dependency feeds defeat. The loop tightens. Ports once controlled cautiously, now swing open under pressure. Canton is no longer an exception, it's a template. Shanghai, Ningbo, Fuzhou, names that will soon feel like fractures rather than gateways. Foreign enclaves grow inside cities, operating by different rhythms, different rules. The contrast is jarring. Order beside erosion. There's a scholarly debate that refuses to settle. Were these treaties meant to integrate China into global trade, or to keep it perpetually off balance? The answer may depend on where you stand, but the outcomes lean unmistakably toward leverage, not partnership. You walk through a treaty port and feel the shift immediately. Architecture changes, language changes, money changes. Signs appear in foreign scripts. Streets feel faster, louder, more impatient. For some, this looks like progress. For others, it feels like invasion without uniforms. Opium flows more freely now, not because it's legal, but because enforcement has been kneecapped. Foreign traders enjoy protection. Local officials hesitate. Smugglers thrive in the gaps. The drug that sparked war emerges stronger than before. Another uncomfortable detail surfaces. Some Chinese elites begin collaborating openly, profiting from the new order. Not everyone resists humiliation. Some monetize it. Survival adapts faster than pride. You sense a deeper injury forming, not physical but psychological. The empire has been forced to acknowledge limits it never imagined facing. The old worldview that China sits at the center of civilization, others orbiting cracks. And when a worldview cracks, everything built on it wobbles. The treaties don't just open ports, they open doubts. You hear people ask questions they were never meant to ask. Are our systems outdated? Are our institutions brittle? Are our values liabilities in a world that rewards aggression? These questions don't explode, they whisper. And whispers are harder to silence. As night falls, lamps glow in foreign quarters while nearby neighborhoods dim earlier than they used to. Two rhythms share one city, but they are not synchronized. Inequality isn't new, but now it's spatially obvious. You realize the war didn't end China's struggle. It relocated it from the battlefield into daily life, from cannons into contracts, from smoke into signatures. And opium, still present, still profitable, still destructive, waits patiently inside this new arrangement, protected not by denial anymore, but by treaties. What follows doesn't look like defeat at first. It looks like adjustment. Life continues because it has to. Markets reopen. Boats return to their routes. Children still chase each other through alleys that have survived worse than treaties. On the surface, the empire breathes. But beneath that breath, something is recalculating and it's not doing the math in China's favor. Addiction has a way of hiding inside routines. After the war, opium doesn't feel like the cause of disaster anymore. It feels like a companion to it. People don't ask why it's here, they ask how to afford it. That shift matters. When a problem stops being questioned and starts being budgeted for, it has already won ground. Here's a historical fact that rarely gets framed emotionally. Opium use increases after the First War. Not because people forget the damage, but because damage makes numbness attractive. Defeat doesn't inspire clarity, it inspires escape. You see it in families first. A father who once smoked occasionally now needs it to sleep. A son starts earlier than his father ever did. Labor slows, not from laziness, but from depletion. Energy leaks out of the day in small, untraceable amounts. Addiction's arithmetic is quiet but brutal. Fewer hours worked, more mistakes made, more debt accumulated. And because the harm spreads thinly across millions, no single loss looks dramatic enough to provoke emergency. This is how a society weakens without collapsing. A quirky, unsettling tidbit emerges from period accounts. Some communities began scheduling work around opium sessions, treating intoxication as predictable downtime rather than disruption. Accommodation replaces resistance. Survival reshapes priorities. There's a scholarly debate that still sparks argument. Did opium directly cripple China's productivity, or did it merely amplify existing inefficiencies created by political stagnation? The uncomfortable answer, again, seems to be both. Addiction magnifies whatever cracks already exist. You notice how the treaty ports glow brighter than surrounding towns. Foreign businesses thrive, warehouses expand, profits circulate outward. Meanwhile, inland regions struggle quietly, disconnected from the wealth passing through their borders. The imbalance becomes geographical. Pain acquires a map. Opium seeps inland faster now, carried along the same routes that once moved grain and cloth. Villages far from the coast feel the pull without understanding its origin. Addiction doesn't need explanation, it just needs access. Another detail slips in that changes the tone. Some local leaders begin encouraging controlled opium use among laborers, believing it keeps workers calm and compliant. This isn't ignorance, it's utilitarian cruelty disguised as pragmatism. When people become tools, relief becomes lubricant. Trust erodes further. Families stop expecting protection from the state. Communities rely on themselves, then on whatever gives immediate comfort. Long-term thinking shrinks. Planning a future feels arrogant when the present is so exhausting. You realize something important here. Opium doesn't just dull pain, it dulls outrage. It makes injustice feel heavy but distant, like something too large to confront. That emotional dampening may be its most destructive effect of all. Foreign observers note China's passivity and mistake it for cultural weakness. They don't see the internal hemorrhage. They don't see the energy drain. They just see a society that isn't resisting loudly enough to be taken seriously. Into this thinning air step people who believe they are bringing clarity. They arrive with books, sermons, pamphlets, and a confidence that feels almost aerodynamic. Missionaries, reformers, observers, each convinced they understand the problem better than those living inside it. They walk through treaty ports and see two Chinas at once. One wounded, one opening, and they choose which one to describe depending on who's listening back home. You hear their arguments echo through salons and letters. Opium is a sin. Opium is a symptom. Opium is a necessary evil. Opium is not our responsibility. These positions don't always contradict each other, they just occupy different moral time zones. Here's a historical fact that complicates the story. Some of the loudest foreign critics of opium in China were citizens of the same nations that profited from its trade. Moral outrage and economic benefit traveled together, rarely speaking to each other. Reform movements gained traction abroad, even as shipments continued to move. You feel the contradiction sharpen. A sermon condemns addiction in the morning. A contract enables it in the afternoon. Both are considered sincere. A quirky tidbit from missionary diaries. Some described opium dens in almost romantic language. Dim lamps, hushed voices, drifting smoke, before condemning them in the next paragraph. Even critics were not immune to the atmosphere the drug created. Description softened judgment, whether they meant it to or not. Debates multiply. Is addiction a moral failing or a medical condition? Should users be punished or treated? Should the trade be banned or regulated? These questions feel modern, but here they're asked without modern tools. No rehabilitation infrastructure. No standardized treatment, just opinion, conviction, and consequence. There's a scholarly debate that continues today. Did missionary pressure meaningfully slow the opium trade? Or did it merely provide moral cover while the system adapted? The record suggests small victories paired with large evasions. Awareness rose. Consumption did not fall in proportion. You watch how narratives are shaped. Abroad, China is portrayed as weak, corrupt, in need of guidance. At home, foreign criticism feels selective concern without accountability. Resentment grows, not just toward opium, but toward the hypocrisy surrounding it. And yet, seeds are planted. Medical perspectives begin to shift. Addiction is slowly recognized as something that changes the body, not just the will. This idea is fragile, incomplete, but new. It challenges the older assumption that suffering is proof of moral failure. You see reformers inside China begin to echo these ideas cautiously, not loudly. Loudness still invites retaliation, but quietly, in pamphlets and private discussions, the idea forms that the problem may require care, not just punishment. Still, the system resists coherence. For every voice calling for compassion, another calls for discipline. For every proposal to ban the drug, another warns of rebellion. For every moral argument, a financial one pushes back. Foreign enclaves continue to prosper. Inland regions continue to strain. Opium continues to move. You realize something subtle. The debate itself has become part of the distraction. While arguments refine themselves, reality advances. While people choose sides, the substance chooses routes. Night returns, lamp glow, sermons on, pipes are cleaned again, and between belief and behavior, a gap remains wide enough for addiction to pass through untouched. The second time, it hurts differently because now you recognize the pattern. By the time tensions rise again, no one is pretending this is about misunderstanding. The language is sharper, less polite. Requests sound like demands. Demands sound like inevitabilities. The First War taught one side that force works and taught the other that restraint invites pressure. Those are lessons that don't cancel each other out, they collide. Opium never really leaves the stage. It just stops being the headline. Here's the historical fact that locks the loop in place. The Second Opium War erupts, not because the first conflict failed to settle terms, but because it settled them too well for the wrong people. Foreign powers now expect compliance as a baseline, not a concession. A small incident becomes the spark. It always does. A ship, a flag, an arrest. Details blur because they don't matter as much as momentum does. Once expectations harden, excuses multiply on both sides. Diplomacy strains under the weight of assumptions. You sense exhaustion inside China. Not fear, this time fatigue. The kind that comes from realizing resistance will be punished, and compliance will be exploited anyway. When every option costs something vital, morale leaks out through resignation. A quirky detail from this period. Some officials reportedly referred to negotiations as counting losses in advance. They no longer hope to win, only to limit damage. That shift in mindset is as consequential as any battle. Foreign forces return with greater coordination, broader coalitions, and clearer objectives. This is no longer a lesson, it's enforcement. Ports are pressured, capitals threatened, symbolism becomes explicit. The message is unmistakable. Access will be expanded, or it will be taken. There's a scholarly debate that cuts sharply here. Was China's resistance in the Second War irrational pride or rational defense against incremental domination? The answer depends on whether you measure outcomes by survival or sovereignty. One can be preserved while the other erodes. You watch defenses fall again, faster this time, not because they're weaker, but because expectations are lower. Shock is gone, the surprise has burned out. What remains is grim familiarity, and then comes the moment that lingers longest in memory. Foreign troops enter spaces once considered untouchable. The symbolism lands harder than the damage itself. This isn't just loss, it's exposure. The illusion of insulation shatters. Another unsettling detail. Looting and destruction coexist with formal negotiations, as if chaos and civility are running on parallel tracks. Civilization argues terms while its symbols burn. The contradiction is not accidental, it's leverage. When the treaties follow, they deepen everything the first ones began. More ports, more privileges, more protections for foreigners. Opium still flows now with fewer obstacles than ever. What began as a trade imbalance has become structural dependence. You realize the wound is no longer fresh enough to shock, but not old enough to heal. It sits there, inflamed, shaping behavior. People learn to live around it. Institutions shrink their ambitions. Survival replaces sovereignty as the primary goal. The cities change first, because cities always do. You walk into a treaty port and feel it immediately, like stepping into a room where the furniture has been rearranged while you were asleep. Streets are wider here. Buildings stand straighter, taller, more impatient. Time itself seems to move faster, measured in schedules instead of seasons. This is China, but it's also something else layered on top of it, something humming with foreign clocks. The port doesn't just open to trade, it opens to contrast. On one street, foreign merchants drink imported spirits behind glass windows, discussing markets half a world away. On the next, Chinese laborers carry crates for wages that barely hold their shape from week to week. Wealth doesn't merely arrive, it separates. And separation teaches resentment faster than poverty ever could. Here's the historical fact that gives this transformation its teeth. Treaty ports operated under dual legal systems. Foreigners answered to their own laws. Locals did not. Justice becomes geographic. Step across an invisible line, and accountability changes. That kind of division doesn't just inconvenience people, it reorganizes how they think about power. You notice how behavior shifts accordingly. Chinese residents near foreign zones adjust their manners, their speech. even their posture. Deference becomes survival. Adaptability becomes currency. Identity starts to feel negotiable. A quirky tidbit whispered in old accounts. Some locals joked that treaty ports had two suns, one that rose for foreigners, bright and predictable, and another that flickered for everyone else. Humor becomes a pressure valve when direct criticism feels dangerous. Opium thrives in this split environment. Foreign-run areas become hubs of distribution, protected by extraterritorial privilege. Local authorities hesitate. Who do you arrest when the seller isn't subject to your courts? Enforcement dissolves into jurisdictional confusion. Meanwhile, culture itself begins to hybridize. New fashions appear. New words slip into conversation. New foods become fashionable. For some, this feels like progress modernity arriving early. For others, it feels like erosion, tradition thinning under foreign weight. There's a scholarly debate that still simmers. Did treaty ports accelerate China's modernization, or did they distort it by attaching progress to humiliation? Both arguments find evidence in the same streets. Growth happens, but unevenly, resentfully, under pressure. You feel the social fabric stretch. Young people see opportunity in foreign firms. Elders see loss. Families argue quietly at dinner tables about whether adaptation is wisdom or surrender. These aren't abstract debates, they decide livelihoods. Outside the ports, the contrast sharpens further. Inland towns fall behind, disconnected from the wealth flowing through their own country. Inequality stops being invisible. It becomes spatial, undeniable. Roads lead outward, not inward. Another unsettling detail. Opium dens near treaty ports often grow more elaborate, not less catering to mixed clientele, blending rituals, normalizing dependency across cultures. Addiction doesn't respect borders, but power determines who pays the price. You realize cities aren't just places anymore. They're symbols of exposure, of vulnerability, of a future that feels imposed rather than chosen. And as night falls, the lights in foreign quarters burn later, brighter, while nearby neighborhoods dim early to save oil. Two rhythms again, two realities sharing a map but not a destiny. This is how fragmentation begins, not with collapse, but with coexistence that never quite connects. Arguments start replacing orders. You hear them everywhere now, in tea houses, study halls, private courtyards where voices stay low and doors stay closed. The question isn't whether something has gone wrong. Everyone agrees on that. The argument is about what to do without breaking everything else. Some say prohibition is the only moral answer. Ban opium completely, burn it, shame its users, restore discipline through force if necessary. They speak with urgency, with anger sharpened by humiliation. To them, addiction is decay, and decay must be cut out. Others argue just as fiercely for legalization and regulation. Tax it, control quality, reduce harm. They point out correctly that bans have driven the trade underground, made it more violent, more corrupt, more profitable for smugglers. If the state can't eliminate opium, they argue, it should at least domesticate it. Here's the historical fact that complicates both camps. At various times, the Qing government experimented with both approaches, crackdowns and toleration, punishment and taxation, often switching between them under pressure. Consistency, the one thing addiction policy needs most, never quite arrives. You feel the frustration of reformers who understand systems but lack leverage. They write essays. They propose pilot programs. They argue that addiction is a medical issue requiring treatment, not just a moral failure deserving punishment. This idea is radical enough to sound foreign, even though it's emerging organically from lived reality. A quirky tidbit from reform literature of the time. Some scholars compared opium regulation to flood control. You can't stop the water from existing, they argued. You build channels, reduce damage, protect the population. The metaphor is elegant. Whether it's politically acceptable is another matter. There's a scholarly debate that still divides historians. Did legalization efforts reduce harm where they were tried, or did they legitimize dependency and expand use? The data is fragmentary, contradictory, and deeply political. Evidence bends toward ideology when certainty is scarce. You notice how each proposal runs into the same obstacle: trust. People don't trust the state to regulate fairly. The state doesn't trust local officials to enforce honestly. Foreign powers don't trust reforms that threaten profits. Everyone suspects everyone else of bad faith, and suspicion slows action. Meanwhile, addiction doesn't wait. Opium keeps shaping daily life, while arguments refine themselves. Reform becomes a conversation instead of an intervention. And conversations, no matter how intelligent, don't interrupt supply chains. You sense another layer of damage forming: reform fatigue. People stop believing change is possible. They stop reading new proposals. They stop arguing. Silence returns, not because problems are solved, but because energy has been spent arguing about solutions that never arrive. This is the cruel paradox. The more thoughtful the debate becomes, the easier it is for inaction to hide inside complexity. As night settles in again, you realize reform is no longer just a policy challenge. It's a race against normalization. And normalization is winning quietly, efficiently, without needing anyone's permission. The countryside absorbs the damage last and pays for it longest. You feel the shift when the roads thin out and the houses spread farther apart. There are no treaty ports here, no foreign signs, no visible symbols of empire colliding. Just fields, seasons, and routines that once worked well enough to be trusted. This is where the cost of opium becomes hardest to dramatize and easiest to ignore. At first, the drug arrives as rumor. Something coastal, something urban, something for other people. Then a trader brings it inland, light enough to carry, valuable enough to justify the trip. A village healer experiments. A laborer tries it after an injury. Relief spreads faster than caution ever does. Here's a historical fact that rarely headlines the story. Opium use spread deep into rural China, affecting agricultural productivity at the exact moment the population was growing and land pressure was increasing. Fewer hands working as hard on the same soil changes everything, slowly. You watch farms adjust, a missed planting here, a delayed harvest there. Nothing catastrophic on its own, but debt doesn't care about intention. Taxes are still due, rent still accumulates. When silver is scarce, grain becomes collateral. Land changes hands quietly. Not because families are careless, but because margins vanish. A quirky detail from rural accounts. Some villages tried rotating clean days, communal agreements to avoid smoking during peak agricultural periods. They worked briefly, then someone broke the rule. Then enforcement became awkward. Social bonds strain under private dependency. Opium turns time into something slippery. Days blur. Seasons arrive too soon. Fatigue lingers longer. Work still happens, but with less precision, less urgency. Agriculture doesn't forgive delay. Crops don't negotiate. There's a scholarly debate here that shifts blame uncomfortably. Did opium cause rural poverty, Or did rural poverty make opium irresistible? Again, the answer folds in on itself. Economic pressure invites escape. Escape deepens economic pressure. The loop tightens without needing outside force. You notice how community authority weakens. Elders lose influence when they can't offer solutions. Rituals feel thinner when participants are exhausted. Trust frays not through conflict, but through disappointment. People stop expecting guidance that doesn't arrive. Another quiet consequence surfaces: migration. Young men leave villages for cities, treaty ports, construction sites. Anywhere opportunity flickers, villages hollow out. Those who remain are older, poorer, more strained. Social fabric thins. Opium becomes part of survival math, not a luxury, a tool. Something to dull hunger, pain, hopelessness. When a substance shifts from indulgence to coping mechanism, moral arguments lose traction. You realize something deeply unsettling here. The countryside doesn't rebel. It absorbs, it adapts, it endures, and endurance, while admirable, allows harm to persist far longer than resistance ever would. Night settles over fields instead of ports. Lamps are dimmer here. Pipes glow softly behind closed doors. No one is watching. No one is recording. And because this damage leaves fewer documents, it lasts longer in silence. This is where the empire bleeds without spectacle. Weakness doesn't cause rebellion on its own, but it makes rebellion possible. You start hearing the word before you see the consequences, whispered, reshaped, passed carefully between people who have learned that speaking plainly can be dangerous. Disorder, banditry, uprisings. None of these begin with ideology. They begin with pressure that has nowhere left to go. Opium doesn't create rage. It creates exhaustion. And exhausted societies don't rise. All at once they fracture. Here's the historical fact that anchors this moment. Many of the largest internal rebellions in 19th century China erupted during periods of widespread opium use, fiscal strain, and administrative weakness. Opium didn't cause revolt, but it weakened the state's ability to respond when revolt came. You feel the tension building in rural regions first. Taxes still arrive on schedule. Protection does not. Bandits move more freely because patrols are underpaid, understaffed, or compromised. Some local militias exist, but they're unreliable, fractured by the same addictions and debts as the communities they defend. A quirky, unsettling tidbit from local chronicles. Some rebel groups explicitly banned opium among their fighters, believing sobriety was essential for discipline. In a strange inversion, rebellion sometimes demanded clarity where society had settled for numbness. You notice how belief systems begin to harden. When institutions fail, people look elsewhere for meaning. New movements promise moral renewal, purification, restoration. These ideas spread fastest where trust in the state has thinned the most. Opium didn't just weaken bodies, it weakened belief in continuity. There's a scholarly debate that remains sharp. Were these rebellions inevitable given population growth and economic strain, or did opium tip the balance by draining resilience from both rulers and ruled? Again, the answer resists simplicity, but timing matters, and opium hollowed out the state at the worst possible moment. You watch how the government responds slowly, unevenly. Troops are raised, but discipline is inconsistent. Funding arrives late. Command structures wobble. Suppression costs silver the state no longer has. Every response drains more strength. Meanwhile, rebellion feeds on symbolism, destroying tax offices, burning records, rejecting opium as foreign poison. Even when these acts don't change material conditions, they offer something addiction never does: purpose. Another uncomfortable detail: some rebels used opium themselves, despite public bans, as a way to manage fear or pain. Ideals strain under reality. Even resistance is not immune to the habits it condemns. You sense the feedback loop tightening. Rebellion disrupts agriculture. Disrupted agriculture deepens poverty. Poverty fuels both addiction and unrest. The state spends what little remains on suppression, neglecting reform. Each attempt to restore order creates new fractures. This is where collapse starts being whispered, though not yet believed. You realize something crucial. Opium didn't just weaken China's economy or military, it weakened its reaction time. When crisis came, the empire moved too slowly, too cautiously, too divided to respond decisively. And history is unforgiving to systems that hesitate under pressure. Night falls again. Fires glow in the distance. Some from villages, some from camps, some from places you're not meant to ask about. The land doesn't sleep easily anymore. And beneath the unrest, beneath the slogans and the smoke, the same quiet exhaustion persists. At the center of everything, the court hesitates. You imagine it as a vast room filled with voices that never quite meet, memorials stacked high, advisors divided into camps, each convinced delay is safer than decisiveness. Every option on the table feels dangerous, and so the table stays crowded while nothing is chosen. This is paralysis, not ignorance. Here's the historical fact that defines this phase. By the late Qing period, the imperial court understood the scale of the opium problem and its connection to foreign pressure, internal decay, and unrest, but reforms were repeatedly stalled by factionalism, fear of backlash, and concern over legitimacy. Knowing became a burden rather than a catalyst. You sense how arguments circle endlessly. One faction insists strict prohibition will restore moral order. Another warns it will provoke rebellion and foreign retaliation. A third suggests gradual reform, pilot programs, compromise. Each proposal threatens a different interest. No one wants to be responsible for the wrong collapse. A quirky but telling detail from court records: some officials delayed submitting urgent reports until astrologically inauspicious days had passed, hoping time itself might soften the crisis. When governance begins to lean on superstition, urgency has already lost the room. The emperor sits at the center of this fog, insulated by ritual, distanced by layers of protocol. Decisions arrive, filtered, stripped of urgency, polished into something manageable. By the time reality reaches the throne, it is already old news. There's a scholarly debate that remains unresolved. Was Qing inaction the result of cultural rigidity or of rational fear in an impossible geopolitical position? Reform threatened internal revolt. Resistance threatened foreign war. Inaction, perversely, seemed survivable, at least in the short term. You watch the consequences of delay ripple outward. Provincial officials stop waiting for guidance and begin improvising. Enforcement varies wildly from region to region. Some crack down brutally, Others look away entirely. Law loses consistency, and consistency is the skeleton of authority. Another subtle damage appears: credibility erosion. Each announced reform that isn't enforced teaches the population that declarations are optional. People stop listening. Obedience becomes situational. Once that lesson is learned, it's almost impossible to unteach. Opium policy becomes symbolic rather than effective. Edicts are issued to reassure, gestures are made to appease. Foreign powers are promised cooperation, domestic audiences are promised resolve. Neither side is fully convinced. You realize the tragedy here isn't moral failure, it's strategic exhaustion. The system is overwhelmed by the number of crises arriving simultaneously. No reform can be isolated anymore. Everything touches everything else. And so the court waits for better timing, clearer signs, external shifts. But waiting in this moment is not neutral. It favors the forces already in motion: addiction, foreign leverage, social fragmentation. Far from the court, far from the villages, far even from the smoke itself, the benefits are adding up neatly. You don't see them here. You have to imagine offices with clean floors and ledgers kept in straight lines. You have to imagine investors who will never touch a pipe, never smell the sweetness in the air, never watch a family quietly sell its future. Distance does something strange to responsibility. It turns consequence into abstraction. Here's the historical fact that reframes the entire tragedy. Profits from the opium trade helped stabilize and expand foreign economies at a time when industrialization demanded constant capital flow. Railways, factories, fleets, all of them drank from streams of money that included opium revenue. Whether acknowledged publicly or not, you feel the imbalance settle into permanence. In Britain and beyond, opium is discussed as a policy problem, a moral embarrassment, a political inconvenience, but rarely as a lived catastrophe. Debates happen in newspapers, parliaments, salons, carefully, respectfully. Meanwhile, the damage remains offshore, conveniently uncounted in domestic statistics. A quirky, bitter tidbit from economic correspondence of the era. Some analysts referred to opium revenue as transitional, something unfortunate but necessary until better trade patterns emerged. Transitional problems have a habit of becoming structural when they pay too well. You notice how language insulates conscience. Addiction becomes demand. Suffering becomes market response. Collapse becomes instability. When harm is translated into economics, it stops sounding urgent and starts sounding manageable. There's a scholarly debate that stretches into the present. To what extent did imperial expansion depend on morally compromised revenue streams, and would industrial dominance have emerged without them? The question is uncomfortable because it threatens comforting narratives of progress. You realize something crucial here. China's decline isn't just its own story. It's part of a global redistribution of strength. Weakness in one place becomes leverage in another. Dependency is exported as stability. Foreign powers don't need to administer China directly. They don't need to govern its people or feed its poor. They just need access to ports, to markets, to rules written in their favor. Control without caretaking. influence without accountability. Opium fades further into the background here, not because it's gone, but because it's doing its job efficiently. It no longer needs protection. It has infrastructure, it has precedent, it has treaties. You see how outrage abroad softens into reform theater. Committees are formed, pledges are made, small restrictions are announced. None of them threaten the core mechanics. The machine continues to hum while promising future adjustment. Meanwhile, inside China, resentment deepens not just toward foreigners, but toward a global order that feels rigged. The sense of humiliation grows teeth. Memory sharpens. Narratives harden. You understand now why this period doesn't just wound a generation, it shapes identity. The sense that suffering was profitable for others leaves scars that don't fade quietly. They wait. By now, punishment feels familiar and strangely ineffective. You see it in the way new crackdowns are announced with less ceremony than before, as if even the messengers know they're repeating themselves. Arrests happen, dens are raided, pipes are smashed, sentences are handed down. For a moment, the system looks alive again, capable of action, capable of force. And then the trade adapts. Here's the historical fact that explains why this keeps failing. Criminalization pushed opium deeper underground, fragmenting the market into smaller, harder to track networks that were often more violent, more corrupt, and more resilient than before. What had once been visible became diffuse, and diffusion is hard to fight. You watch the pattern repeat. Each ban raises prices. Higher prices raise profits. Higher profits attract risk takers who don't care about moral arguments or social stability. Enforcement becomes a business expense. Addiction becomes more expensive, not less common. A quirky but telling detail from enforcement records. Some smugglers deliberately adulterated opium to stretch supply, increasing harm while maintaining demand. Prohibition didn't reduce suffering, it redistributed it, often downward, toward those least able to absorb it. You feel the frustration inside the bureaucracy. Officials tasked with enforcement know the math is against them. They arrest a few, miss many. They disrupt one route, 3 more appear. Success is measured in seizures, not outcomes. And cichers make good reports. There's a scholarly debate that keeps resurfacing. Did criminalization fail because it was poorly enforced, or because the policy itself misunderstood addiction? Modern perspectives tend to argue the latter. Punishment addresses behavior. Addiction rewires incentive. You notice another consequence: emerging quietly selective enforcement. Those with connections avoid punishment. Those without become examples. Justice starts to look arbitrary. Fear replaces respect. Compliance becomes a gamble. Communities learn to hide better. Signals become subtler. Trust networks shrink. The state becomes an outsider in places it once governed. Criminalization doesn't restore authority, it competes with it. And still, opium flows. You realize something unsettling. Every failed crackdown teaches the market how to survive the next one. Experience accumulates on the wrong side. The system is learning, but not the way reformers hoped. By night, the glow of lamps returns. Pipes reappear, cleaner, quieter, more concealed. Addiction becomes lonelier now, less ritualized, more desperate. Shame replaces ceremony. Harm intensifies. This is the paradox of hard control without structural change. It looks strong, but it feeds the very resilience it's trying to break. The state spends more energy for less effect. Exhaustion deepens. You stand in the echo of another announcement, another promise of order restored. The words sound thinner now, and beneath them, the same currents move older, smarter, harder to catch. At some point, shame stops being private and starts being shared. You feel it in the way people talk about the past now, not with nostalgia, but with irritation, with a tightness that suggests something unresolved. Opium is no longer just a habit or a policy failure. It becomes a symbol, a shorthand for everything that went wrong at once. Foreign intrusion, internal weakness, missed chances, humiliation that didn't arrive in one blow, but soaked in slowly. Here's the historical fact that reshapes memory itself. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, opium was increasingly framed in Chinese discourse, not merely as a drug problem, but as a national trauma, evidence of how the country had been exploited when it was most vulnerable. Addiction became history, not just habit. You notice how stories harden, texts, speeches, conversations begin to simplify the past. Complexity gets trimmed away. The debate over causes trade imbalance, governance failure. Global capitalism compresses into something easier to carry. We were weakened, and others took advantage. This reframing does something powerful. It turns suffering into identity, a quirky but telling detail from early nationalist writings. Opium users were sometimes described less as individuals and more as symptoms, embodiments of a poisoned era. Compassion thins when memory becomes symbolic. Healing takes a backseat to meaning. There's a scholarly debate that still runs quietly beneath modern narratives. Does framing opium primarily as foreign oppression risk erasing internal responsibility, or does it accurately capture the asymmetry of power that defined the era? Both views coexist uneasily, depending on what the story needs to do. You see how memory is weaponized and protected at the same time. Opium becomes a lesson taught to warn against complacency, against division, against dependence. It is invoked to justify reform, resistance, unity, even when the details are blurred. This is where the story stops being only about the past. Because once humiliation becomes collective memory, it starts shaping future decisions. Suspicion toward foreign influence deepens. Urgency around sovereignty sharpens. Patience for gradual change thins. History stops being something you study and starts being something you carry. You realize that opium's most enduring damage may not be physical or economic, but psychological. It taught a civilization that weakness invites intervention, that internal decay has external consequences, that recovery must be guarded fiercely or risk repetition. As night settles again, the tone shifts. This isn't numbness anymore. It's alertness. Pain remembered instead of avoided. The smoke of the past lingers, but now it's watched, not welcomed. The drug fades from daily life eventually, but the lesson does not. Recovery never announces itself with trumpets. It arrives tired, cautious, and late. You don't feel a sudden turning point, just a gradual resistance to the old normal. Fewer pipes passed openly, more quiet conversations about control instead of tolerance. The shift isn't dramatic enough to feel like victory, but it's real enough to matter. Here's the historical fact that marks this slow pivot. In the early 20th century, sustained domestic reforms, combined with international pressure, finally began to reduce opium production and consumption in China. Not overnight, not cleanly, but measurably. For the first time, the curve bends. You notice how the language changes. Officials stop pretending the problem can be managed casually. Addiction is spoken of as something that weakens the nation not just morally, but strategically. Health becomes linked to sovereignty, sobriety to survival. Treatment centers appear, imperfect and underfunded. Education campaigns circulate. Local enforcement grows more consistent, not harsher, just steadier. The work is unglamorous. It doesn't photograph well, but it accumulates. A quirky detail from reform-era reports. Some former users became the most effective advocates for suppression, not because they were moral exemplars, but because they understood the mechanics of dependence intimately. Experience turns into leverage when shame loosens its grip. There's a scholarly debate that continues here. Did reform succeed because foreign powers reduced pressure, or because Chinese society finally aligned will, policy, and enforcement at the same time? Likely both. Timing, once again, proved decisive. You feel how memory plays a role. The humiliation hasn't faded, it has focused effort. Opium is no longer tolerated as private weakness or economic necessity. It is framed as a warning sign, something to be confronted early, decisively, before it embeds itself again. Still, recovery isn't clean. Relapses happen. Smuggling persists. Some regions lag behind others. But the direction is different now. For the first time in generations, the future doesn't feel anesthetized. You realize something important. Stopping opium wasn't just about stopping a drug. It was about rebuilding trust between people and institutions, between health and governance, between autonomy and engagement with the world. As night falls, the lamps feel less heavy. The silence is no longer numbing, it's resting. And rest, when chosen rather than forced, feels like strength returning quietly to the body. The empire that suffered doesn't come back exactly as it was. It comes back alert. You reach the part of the story that never feels finished because it isn't. By now, opium no longer dominates daily life the way it once did. Pipes are fewer. Dens are quieter or gone. The smoke that once felt unavoidable now feels out of place, like a smell that lingers after a long storm has passed. And yet, nothing about this feels like a clean ending, because what survives isn't the drug. What survives is the memory of how easily comfort became control. Here's the historical fact that gives this ending its weight. Modern Chinese political thought, reform movements, and national identity were profoundly shaped by the memory of the opium era, often referred to as the beginning of a century of humiliation. Policy decisions long after the last pipes cooled were influenced by this lesson, sometimes explicitly, sometimes subconsciously. You notice how the past is used now. Opium is invoked as a warning whenever dependence feels tempting, economic, cultural, technological. It becomes shorthand for vulnerability. A reminder that weakness doesn't need to be invented by outsiders. It only needs to be exploited once it exists. There's a scholarly debate that still refuses to die. Was the destruction caused more by foreign aggression or internal decay? And the honest answer remains uncomfortable. Neither explanation works alone. External pressure mattered because internal systems were already strained. Internal weakness became catastrophic because external powers knew how to apply pressure. History doesn't choose villains cleanly, it chooses interactions. You realize something quietly unsettling. The most dangerous part of the opium story isn't that people were poisoned. It's that the poisoning felt manageable for too long. It fit into routines. It adjusted to policy. It waited patiently while everyone argued about responsibility. That pattern repeats across centuries under different names. Substances change, systems change. The temptation remains the same: to trade long-term strength for short-term relief, especially when pressure feels unbearable. Opium didn't destroy China by force alone. It taught a lesson about how force can arrive disguised as convenience. You step back from the timeline now and feel the story breathe. It isn't screaming anymore. It doesn't need to. The warning is steady, almost gentle. Pay attention to what numbs you. Be suspicious of what feels too relieving during moments of weakness. Notice who profits when a society grows tired, because history rarely repeats itself exactly. It rhymes softly until someone finally listens. Now let the images slow. Imagine the lamps dimming one by one, not in fear this time, but in rest. The streets are quieter than before, but not hollow, just settled. The kind of quiet that comes after a long illness, when the body hasn't fully recovered, but it knows the worst has passed. You don't hear smoke curling anymore. You hear breathing, steady, uneven, real. This story didn't end with a victory parade, because most real recoveries don't. It ended with awareness, with scars that taught caution, with memory that refused to fade completely, and that, in its own way, became protection. As you lie there listening, you're not meant to feel anger or guilt or even sadness, just clarity. Clarity about how fragile systems can be when relief is mistaken for solution. Clarity about how power prefers patience over force. Clarity about how history isn't something that happens to people. It's something that forms between choices, habits, and moments of exhaustion. The past exhales now. You don't need to carry its weight tonight, just its lesson, light enough to hold, heavy enough to remember. Let your thoughts loosen. Let the timeline fade. Let the smoke dissolve completely into dark, open air. You're safe here, in this moment, listening to a story that already knows how it ends and trusts you to fall asleep wiser, not burdened. Sweet dreams.